Hello again, guys.
I might have to disappear for like 2 minutes because my mom needs me to go somehow drag a mattress upstairs.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. It might be a good time to do it now since we're still waiting on a couple.
Yeah, I'm just about to go check and see if it's downstairs.
Okay. Ah. Ah.
Ah.
Ah.
Ah.
Wash just walked by. Like, what's
Wash.
He just walked by and was like, and there's Jay. They say hi. Yeah, this is, huh? Hunter is on here.
I did the thing that you wanted me to send it out to other kids.
Hunter, did you hear that? Walsh said that he sent out the thing that you wanted him to do. Look at his background. Oh, no. That's good comedy. Have you done the interactive classrooms on Zoom?
I've tried.
So weird. Yeah. You like move them around and stuff. We did like an auditorium seating kind of thing.
Can we do one for this class?
Oh yeah, we could maybe do one for this class.
Oh, Jay, your voice is super echoey.
It is. Oh, it might be. Well,
A lot of reverb.
It is not a joke. It's very serious, but it is very funny. It was when Cheek saw me earlier and was like, "I got to tell you something." Like, it was this. What day is this? This is the 9th, 8th. Close. Could hardly be any closer. Jay, you look so different. I don't know if it's because you're not wearing your glasses or because I can't see your hair or like what, but you look so different. You actually like remind me of this guy that I follow on Instagram who's so funny. Okay.
ooh. Sorry, my audio's all.
No, that's okay.
Jay, is your house empty?
Who?
Is your house empty?
Yeah, I'm kind
Oh,
of.
that's fine.
I'm kind of in a really echoey area of my house. Like it's a big, tall room with nothing in it. So.
Right. Because there's nothing to fill the space, so your voice just bounces off everywhere.
Yep.
I don't know how I did that. I must have super strength or something.
You what?
I must have like super strength if I was able to carry up a queen-sized mattress upstairs.
Maryland's getting strong.
That does take strength. I have moved a queen mattress before and I could certainly not do it on my own. Mattresses are not heavy, they're just bulky and awkward to carry.
I
mean,
agree.
it was rolled up in a box, but still.
Oh, well, that helps for sure. But I think it would feel heavier that way too, though. It's all rolled up. Okay, so I am making a slight change, which is that on today's agenda, it says reading and Stephen King reading. And the discussion post for this week, which we'll do tomorrow, is labeled reading. However, I looked at both of those. I've read the Stephen King before. I had not read the read before, and they're both pretty long. So I don't want to read them both. So what we're going to do instead is read the Stephen King one. It's also, I think it's like 22 pages, but they're all like big print and big margins and everything. So it's not actually that long. Like we'll get through it. And it's pretty interesting to read. So even though we're going to read Stephen King and write our discussion post about him, it's going to be under the one that says reading. I'm just choosing to do things a little bit differently than how they would probably prefer me to, but it'll be all right. So to show you guys where this is, since it's not in our textbook, I'm gonna share my screen for just a second, or maybe for more than a second. Under the content tab, you can go to course calendar, and this course calendar is not accurate, but it's got links to all of the reading that is not in the textbook. And we're not even doing all of it. We didn't do Allegory of the Cave. We're not doing shitty first drafts. We did last year. It's not because I'm opposed to it. We're just not doing it. But we're going to do Toolbox by Stephen King. I think I'm just going to download it so I can open it up and make it bigger. It says it's 29 pages, but I mean, this is what it looks like. It doesn't even start until the 3rd page. So we're going to read this together. This is a pretty interesting passage. And like I said, it goes by pretty quickly, but we think of Stephen King as like, you know, the master of horror, but he's also a writer and he knows what he's doing. I mean, he sells more books than almost anyone else probably. He just like cranks them out too. I mean, it is one of my favorite books, and it's like, I think it's 1,129 pages. How did he just crank that out? I don't know. And it's so complicated. I love it. But all that to say, he may be like a horror writer, and a lot of people think that he's not a particularly good writer. That's up for debate, but he certainly knows what he's doing because he's sold millions of copies of lots of books. So here we go, On Writing by Stephen King. And I think this is a chapter out of his book. He has a book called On Writing, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's like a how-to book about writing. And this chapter is called Toolbox. Oh, it's going to be weird. Like, I can tell that the pages are going to want to get stuck and stuff. Oh, I hate that. Okay. Never mind. I'll check that later. Grandpa was a carpenter. He built houses, stores, and banks. He chain smoked Camel cigarettes and hammered nails and planks. He was level on the level, shaved even every door, and voted for Eisenhower because Lincoln won the war. That's one of my favorite John Prine lyrics. I love John Prine, probably because my grandpa was also a carpenter. I don't know about stores and banks, but Guy Pillsbury built his share of houses and spent a good many years making sure the Atlantic Ocean and the harsh seacoast winters didn't wash away the Winslow Homer estate and Prout's Neck. Faza, which I guess is what he calls his grandpa. Faza smoked cigars, though, not Camels. It was my Uncle Orrin, also a carpenter, who smoked the Camels. And when Faza retired, it was Uncle Orrin who inherited the old fellow's toolbox. I don't remember it being there in the garage on the day I dropped the cinder block on my foot, but it was probably sitting in its accustomed place just outside the nook where my cousin Donald kept his hockey sticks, ice skates, and baseball glove. The toolbox was what we called a big un. It had 3 levels, the top 2 removable, all 3 containing little drawers as cunning as Chinese boxes. It was handmade, of course. Dark wooden slats were bound together by tiny nails and strips of brass. The lid was held down by big latches. To my child's eye, they looked like the latches on a giant's lunchbox. Inside the top was a silk lining, rather odd in such a context, and made more striking still by the pattern, which was pinkish red cabbage roses, fading into a smog of grease and dirt. On the sides were great big grab handles. You never saw a toolbox like this one for sale at Walmart or Western Auto, believe me. When my uncle first got it, he found a brass etching of a famous Homer painting. I believe it was the undertow, lying in the bottom. Some years later, Uncle Orrin had it authenticated by a Homer expert in New York, and a few years after that, I believe he sold it for a good piece of money. Exactly how or why Faza came by the engraving in the first place is a mystery, but there was no mystery about the origins of the toolbox. He made it himself. One summer day, I helped Uncle Orrin replace a broken screen on the far side of the house. I might have been 8 or 9 at the time. I remember following him with the replacement screen balanced on my head like a native bearer in a Tarzan movie. He had the toolbox by the grab handles, horsing it along at thigh level. As always, Uncle Orrin was wearing khaki pants and a clean white t-shirt. Pardon me. Sweat gleamed in his graying army crew cut. A camel hung from his lower lip. When I came in years later with a pack of Chesterfields in my breast pocket, Uncle Orrin sneered at them and called them stockade cigarettes. COVID. We finally reached the window with the broken screen, and he set the toolbox down with an audible sigh of relief. When Dave and I tried to lift it from its place on the garage floor, each of us holding one of the handles, we could barely budge it. Of course, we were just little kids back then, but even so, I guess that Foz's fully loaded toolbox weighed between 80 and 120 pounds. Uncle Orrin let me undo the big latches. The common tools were all on the top layer of the box. There was a hammer, a saw, the pliers, a couple size wrenches, and an adjustable. There was a level with that mystic yellow window in the middle, a drill. The various bits were neatly drawered further down in the depths, and 2 screwdrivers. Uncle Orrin asked me for a screwdriver. Which one? I asked. Either or, he replied. The broken screen was held on by loop head screws, and it really didn't matter whether he used a regular screwdriver or the Phillips on them. With loop heads, you just stuck the screwdriver's barrel through the hole at the top of the screw and then spun it the way you spin a tire iron once you've got the lug nuts loose. God dang it. Come on. I hate it when this happens to PDFs. Just be patient. Okay. Uncle Orrin took the screws out. There were 8, which he handed to me for safekeeping, and then he removed the screen. He set it against the house and held up the new one. The holes in the screen's frame made it up neatly with the holes in the window frame. Uncle Orrin grunted with approval when he saw this. He took the loop head screws back from me, one after the other, got them started with his fingers, then tightened them down just as he'd loosened them by inserting the screwdriver's barrel through the loops and turning them. When the screen was secure, Uncle Orrin gave me back the screwdriver and told me to put it back in the toolbox and latch her up. I did, but I was puzzled. I asked him why he'd lugged Foz's toolbox all the way around the house if all he needed was that one screwdriver. He could have carried a screwdriver in the back pocket of his khakis. Yeah, but Stevie, he said, bending to grasp the handles, I didn't know what else I might find to do once I got out here, did I? It's best to have your tools with you. If you don't, you're apt to find something that you didn't expect and get discouraged. I want to suggest that to write to your best abilities, it behooves you to construct your own toolbox and then build up enough muscle so you can carry it with you. Then instead of looking at a hard job and getting discouraged, you will perhaps seize the correct tool and get immediately to work. Foz's toolbox had 3 levels. I think that yours should have at least 4. You could have 5 or 6, I suppose, but there comes a point where a toolbox becomes too large to be portable and thus loses its chief virtue. You'll also want all those little drawers for your screws and nuts and bolts, but where you put those drawers and what you put in them, well, that's your little red wagon, isn't it? You'll find you have most of the tools you need already, but I advise you to look at each one again as you load it into your box. Try to see each one new. Remind yourself of its function, and if some are rusty, as they may be if you haven't done this seriously in a while, clean them off. Common tools go on top. The commonest of all, the bread of writing, is vocabulary. In this case, you can happily pack what you have without the slightest bit of guilt and inferiority. As the whore said to the bashful sailor, it ain't how much you've got, honey, it's how you use it. Also, now that I've said that, I'm kind of remembering that I think there's some language in this, and you guys were in a college class now, so I'm just going to say it if we come across it. Some writers have enormous vocabularies. These are folks who'd know if there really is such a thing as an insalubrious dithyramb or a cousining raconteur, people who haven't missed a multiple choice answer in Wilfred Funk's It Pays to Increase Your Word Power in 30 years or so. For example, and here's a passage from H.P. Lovecraft, who is known for very flowery language. The leathery, undeteriorative, and almost indestructible quality was an inherent attribute of the thing's form of organization and pertained to some Paleogean cycle of invertebrate evolution, utterly beyond our powers of speculation. What? Like, I don't know what that means. So I could try to tear it down, but I don't want to. Here's another. I don't know this guy. In some of the cups, there was no evidence whatever that anything had been planted. In others, wilted brown stalks gave testimony to some inscrutable depredation. And here's a third. It says you'll like it. Cormac McCarthy. Someone snatched the old woman's blindfold from her, and she and the juggler were clouded away. And when the company turned into sleep and the low fire was roaring in the blast like a thing alive, these 4 yet crouched at the edge of the firelight among their strange chattels and watched how the ragged flames led down in the wind as if sucked by some maelstrom out there in the void, which some vortex in that waste opposite to which man's transit and his reckonings alike lay abrogate. I have no idea what that means, guys. That's like, it's just too much. And also that's one sentence, and it is a correct sentence. It's not a run-on sentence, but it's just messy. I mean, clearly I'm not trying to like sneeze at Cormac McCarthy. He's done a lot and published a lot, but other writers use smaller, simpler vocabularies. Examples of this hardly seem necessary, but I'll offer a couple of my favorites just the same. Here's Ernest Hemingway, who is known for his brevity. He came to the river was there. I like that. Theodore Sturgeon, they caught the kid doing something nasty under the bleachers. And Douglas Fairbairn, this is what happened. Pretty easy. Some of the owner men were kind, oh, this is one more, sorry. Some of the owner men were kind because they hated what they had to do, and some of them were angry because they hated to be cruel, and some of them were cold because they had long ago found that one could not be an owner unless one were cold. The Steinbeck sentence is especially interesting. It's 50 words long. Of those 50 words, 39 have but one syllable. That leaves 11, but even that number is deceptive. Steinbeck uses because 3 times, owner twice, and hated twice. There is no word longer than 2 syllables in the entire sentence. The structure is complex. The vocabulary is not far removed from the old Dick and Jane primers. The Grapes of Wrath is, of course, a fine novel. I believe that Blood Meridian is another, although there are great whacks of it that I don't fully understand. What of that? I can't decipher the words to many of the popular songs I love either, which I think is a fair point. There's also stuff you'll never find in the dictionary, but it's still vocabulary. Check out the following. Okay, I'm going to try to read this, but well, I'm probably not going to say one of these words. Hey, what do you want from me? Here come Jaime. No, I'm not going to say these things. Sorry. This last is phonetically rendered street vocabulary. Few writers have Wolf's ability to translate such stuff to the page. Elmore Leonard is another writer who can do it. Some street rap gets into the dictionary eventually, but not until it's safely dead. And I don't think you'll ever find in Webster's Unabridged. Put your vocabulary on the top shelf of your toolbox and don't make any conscious effort to improve it. You'll be doing that as you read, of course, but that comes later. One of the really bad things you can do to your writing is dress up the vocabulary, looking for long ones because you're maybe a little bit ashamed of your short ones. This is like dressing up a household pet in evening clothes. The pet is embarrassed, and the person who committed this act of premeditated cuteness should be even more embarrassed. Make yourself a solemn promise right now that you'll never use emolument when you mean tip, and you'll never say, John stopped long enough to perform an act of excretion when you mean John stopped long enough to take a shit. If you believe take a shit would be considered offensive or inappropriate by your audience, feel free to say John stopped long enough to move his bowels, or perhaps John stopped long enough to push. I'm not trying to get you to talk dirty, only plain and direct. Remember that the basic rule of vocabulary is use the first word that comes to your mind if it is appropriate and colorful. If you hesitate and cogitate, you will come up with another word. Of course you will. There's always another word. But it probably won't be as good as your first one or as close to what you really mean. I want to pause for just a second to point out 2 things. Number one, that he's obviously making this big extended metaphor about the toolbox that his grandpa had, and like, here's all the stuff in his toolbox. He wants to keep the most important things close to the top, and our writing toolbox, where we keep all of the stuff that we use to make us good writers. And he says, keep vocabulary near the top because that's something that we always have with us. You can pull it out at a moment's notice. I do really agree with what he's saying here. Like, don't try too hard to elevate your vocabulary if that's not what you'd really sound like. And it actually reminds me of, at one point last year, I accidentally gave my English 4 class at the time an assignment and accidentally uploaded an old student's copy rather than a blank copy. And for a while, nobody told me about it. And then finally somebody pointed it out that I had given them all the answers. And the person who'd filled it out was a really good writer. And like, all of her answers were very, very thorough. And Brendan Freeman got upset at whoever ratted us out and was like, see, I was just gonna like put it in my own words. This person said melancholy. I would never say that word. I was just going to put sad. And I was like, yeah, good point. And like, I probably wouldn't have even known, but I appreciated him understanding that like melancholy is not really part of his vocabulary toolbox. That's just not a word that he would normally say. So changing it up to something you would say doesn't mean you're dumbing it down. It just means that you don't sound unnatural, and you want to sound natural. Of course you do. Okay, continuing. The business of meaning is a very big deal. If you doubt it, think of all the times you've heard someone say, I just can't describe it, or that isn't what I mean. Think of all the times you've said those things yourself, usually in a tone of mild or serious frustration. The word is only a representation of the meaning. Even at its best, writing almost always falls short of full meaning. Given that, why in God's name would you want to make things worse by choosing a word which is only a cousin to the one that you really wanted to use? God dang. I'm sorry, this is so annoying that like I just need, you have to scroll so slowly if you want to see all of it. It's so stupid. And do feel free to take appropriateness into account. As George Carlin once observed, in some company, it's perfectly all right to prick your finger, but but very bad form to finger your prick. Stephen King likes a dirty joke occasionally. So, well, what the heck? Where'd it go? You'll also want grammar on the top shelf of your toolbox, and don't annoy me with your moans of exasperation or your cries that you don't understand grammar. You never did understand grammar. You flunked that whole semester in sophomore English. Writing is fun, but grammar sucks, the big one. Relax, chill. We won't spend much time here because we don't need to. One either absorbs the grammatical principles of one's native language in conversation and in reading, or one does not. What sophomore English does or tries to do is little more than the naming of parts. And this isn't high school, because we're in college now. Not that you're not worried that A, your skirt is too short or too long and the other kids will laugh at you. B, you're not going to make the varsity swimming team. Not at Allegro. C, you're still going to be a pimple-studded virgin when you graduate, probably when you die for that matter. D, the physics teacher won't grade the final on a curve. Or E, nobody really likes you anyway, and they never did. Now that all that extraneous shit is out of the way, you can study certain academic matters with a degree of concentration you could never manage while attending the local textbook loony bin. And once you start, you'll find you know almost all the stuff anyway. It is, as I said, mostly a matter of cleaning the rust off the drill bits and sharpening the blade of your saw. Plus, oh to hell with it. If you can remember all the accessories that go with your best outfit, the contents of your purse, the starting lineup of the New York Yankees or the Houston Oilers, or what label Hang On Sloopy by the McCoys was on, you're capable of remembering the difference between a gerund, a verb form used as a noun, and a participle, a verb form used as an adjective. I thought long and hard about whether or not to include a detailed section on grammar in this little book. Part of me would actually like to. I taught it successfully at high school, where it hid under the name Business English, and I enjoyed it as a student. American grammar doesn't have the sturdiness of British grammar. A British advertising man with a proper education can make magazine copy for ribbed condoms sound like the Magna Goddamn Carta, but it has its own scruffy charm. In the end, I decided against it, probably for the same reason William Strunk decided not to recap the basics when he wrote the first edition of the Elements of Style, which if you've never seen the book, of course you've never seen the book Elements of Style, there's no reason why you would have, but it's like a grammar manual by William Strunk and E.B. White, who wrote Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little, and it is great and just makes things really easy to understand. Every English teacher loves it. If you don't know, it's too late. And those really incapable of grasping grammar, as I am incapable of playing certain guitar riffs and progressions, will have little or no use for a book like this anyway. In that sense, I'm preaching to the converted. Yet allow me to go on just a little bit further. Will you indulge me? Vocabulary used in speech or writing organizes itself in 7 parts of speech, 8 if you count interjections such as oh and gosh and forget about it. Communication composed of these parts of speech must be organized by rules of grammar upon which we agree. When these rules break down, confusion and misunderstanding result. Bad grammar produces bad sentences. My favorite example from Strunk and White is this one. As a mother of 5 with another one on the way, my ironing board is always up. Nouns and verbs are the 2 indispensable parts of writing. Without one of each, no group of words can be a sentence, since a sentence is, by definition, a group of words containing a subject and a predicate, noun and verb. These strings of words begin with a capital letter, end with a period, and combine to make a complete thought which starts in the writer's head and then leaps to the reader's. Must you write complete sentences each time, every time? Perish the thought. If your work consists only of fragments and floating clauses, the grammar police aren't going to come and take you away. Even William Strunk, that Mussolini of rhetoric, recognized the delicious pliability of language. It is an old observation, he writes, that the best writers sometimes disregard the rules of rhetoric. Yet he goes on to add this thought, which I urge you to consider. Unless he is certain of doing well, the writer will probably do best to follow the rules. And I'm just pausing here for a second just to say, in like academic writing, you do want to always make sure, and this is probably a duh statement, but you always want to make sure that you are using complete sentences, no fragments, no run-ons. When you're writing creatively, like if you were writing a novel or something, you don't really need to adhere to those rules as much. That being said, I'm reading a book right now, like a published book by a published author, and it's fine, but it has so many fragments and so many just like weird grammatical things that it's a little bit distracting. And I don't think it would be to other people, but to me as an English teacher, it really is. And I have to imagine that at some point, some editor might be like, hey, do you want to maybe like combine some of these fragments, make them a sentence? You want to, do something like that? But somehow it's made it to the shelves and has all of this stuff. So like, you don't have to do it. But if it's like clouding your meaning or if it's too disorganized, people are going to notice. So follow the rules unless you feel like you can get away with not following them. The telling clause here is unless he is certain of doing well. If you don't have a rudimentary grasp of how the parts of speech translate into coherent sentences, how can you be certain that you are doing well? How will you know if you're doing ill for that matter? The answer, of course, is that you can't, you won't. One who does grasp the rudiments of grammar finds a comforting simplicity at its heart, where there need be only nouns, the words that name, and verbs, the words that act. Take any noun, put it with any verb, and you have a sentence. It never fails. Rocks explode. Jane transmits. Mountains float. These are all perfect sentences. Many such thoughts make little rational sense, but even the stranger ones, plums deify, have kind of a poetic weight that's nice. The simplicity of noun-verb construction is useful. At the very least, it can provide a safety net for your writing. Strunk and White caution against too many simple sentences in a row, but simple sentences provide a path you can follow when you fear getting lost in the tangles of rhetoric. All those restrictive and non-restrictive clauses, those modifying phrases, those appositives and compound complex sentences, which probably don't even mean anything to most of y'all. If you start to freak out at the sight of such unmapped territory, unmapped by you at least, just remind yourself that rocks explode, Jane transmits, mountains float, and plums deify. Grammar is not just a pain in the ass. It's the pull you grab to get your thoughts up on their feet and walking. Besides, all those simple sentences worked for Hemingway, didn't they? Even when he was drunk on his ass, he was an effing genius. Agreed. Also, there's a quote from a Hemingway book that I love. He said, know how complicated it is and then state it simply. And he got a lot of flack for how simple his writing was, because it's very much just like subject verb, we ate, we slept, all these like really simple things. He's not being convoluted with the language, but some of his content is very convoluted. He knows how complicated it is, but then he states it simply. If you want to refurbish your grammar, go to your local used bookstore and find a copy of Warner's English Grammar and Composition, the same book most of us took home and dutifully covered with brown paper shopping bags when we were sophomores and juniors in high school. Y'all don't do that anymore. You'll be relieved and delighted, I think, to find that almost all you need is summarized on the front and back end papers of the book. Despite the brevity of his style manual, William Strunk found room to discuss his own dislikes in matters of grammar and usage. He hated the phrase student body, for instance, insisting that studentry was both clearer and without the ghoulish connotations he saw in the former term. He thought personalize a pretentious word. Strunk suggests get up a letterhead to replace personalize your stationery. He hated phrases such as the fact that and along those lines. I have my own dislikes. I believe that anyone using the phrase that's so cool should have to stand in the corner, and that those using the far more odious phrases at this point in time and at the end of the day should be sent to bed without supper or writing paper for that matter. Two of my other pet peeves have to do with this most basic level of writing, and I want to get them off my chest before we move along. I remember teaching this last year and like stopping to ask students if they had any things like that, like any words or phrases that are correct but just bother them when people use them. And I remember Julius Kane was like, no, Miss McClellan, that's not something a normal person does. That's an English teacher thing. So I don't know if you guys have. I don't know. And I can't remember what my examples were anymore, like the phrases that I hate.
I can't remember mine, but I definitely have some. And when I hear them, I'll know.
Okay, good. So I'm more normal than I thought. Maybe Julius was just not, not tuned in.
Not feeling it.
Oh shoot, where'd it go? Where'd it go? Verbs come in two types, active and passive. With an active verb, the subject of the sentence is doing something. With a passive verb, something is being done to the subject of the sentence. The subject's just letting it happen. You should avoid the passive tense. I'm not the only one who says so. You can find the same advice in the Elements of Style. Mr. Strunk and White don't speculate as to why so many writers are attracted to passive verbs, but I'm willing to. I think timid writers like them for the same reason timid lovers like passive partners. The passive voice is safe. There's no troublesome action to contend with. The subject just has to close its eyes and think of England, to paraphrase Queen Victoria. I think unsure writers also feel the passive voice somehow lends their work authority, perhaps even a quality of majesty. If you find instruction manuals in Lawyer's Torts majestic, I guess it does. The timid fellow writes, the meeting will be held at 7 o'clock, because that somehow says to him, put it this way and people will believe you really know. Purge this quisling thought. I don't know that word. Don't be a muggle. Throw back your shoulders, stick out your chin, and put that meeting in charge. Right? The meeting's at 7. There, by God, don't you feel better? I won't say there's no place for passive tense. Suppose, for instance, a fellow dies in the kitchen but ends up somewhere else. The body was carried from the kitchen and placed on the parlor sofa is a fair way to put this, although was carried and was placed still irk the shit out of me. I accept them, but I don't embrace them. What I would embrace is Freddie and Myra carried the body out of the kitchen and laid it on the parlor sofa. Why does the body have to be the subject of the sentence anyway? It's dead, for Christ's sake. Forget about it. 2 pages of the passive voice, just about any business document ever written, in other words, not to mention reams of bad fiction, make me want to scream. It's weak, it's circuitous, and it's frequently torturous as well. How about this? My first kiss will always be recalled by me as how my romance with Shayna was begun. Oh man, who farted, right? A simpler way to express this idea, sweeter and more forceful as well, might be this. My romance with Shayna began with our first kiss. I'll never forget it. I'm not in love with this because it uses with twice in 4 words, but at least we're out of that awful passive voice. You might also notice how much simpler the thought is to understand when it's broken up into 2 thoughts. This makes matters easier for the reader, and the reader must always be your main concern. Without constant reader, you're just a voice quacking into the void. And it's no walk in the park being the guy on the receiving end. Strunk felt the reader was in serious trouble most of the time, E.B. White writes in his introduction to the Elements of Style. A man floundering in a swamp, and that it was the duty of anyone trying to write English to drain this swamp quickly and get his man up on dry ground, or at least throw him a rope. And remember, the writer threw the rope, not the rope was thrown by the writer. Please, oh please. The other piece of advice I want to give you before moving on to the next level of the toolbox is this. The adverb is not your friend. Adverbs, you'll remember from your own version of business English, are words that modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. They're the ones that usually end in ly. Adverbs like the passive voice seem to have been created with the timid writer in mind. With the passive voice, the writer usually expresses fear of not being taken seriously. It's the voice of little boys wearing shoe polish mustaches and little girls clumping around in mommy's high heels. With adverbs, the writer usually tells us he or she is afraid, he or she isn't expressing himself or herself clearly, that he or she is not getting the point or the picture across. Consider the sentence, he closed the door firmly. It's by no means a terrible sentence, at least it's got an active verb going for it, but ask yourself if firmly really has to be there. You can argue that it expresses a degree of difference between he closed the door and he slammed the door, and you'll get no argument from me. But what about context? What about all the enlightening, not to say emotionally moving, prose which came before he closed the door firmly? Shouldn't this tell us how he closed the door? And if the foregoing prose does tell us, isn't firmly an extra word? Isn't it redundant? Someone out there now is accusing me of being tiresome and anal retentive. I deny it. I believe the road to hell is paved with adverbs, and I will shout it from the rooftops. To put it another way, they're like dandelions. If you have 1 on your lawn, it looks pretty and unique. If you fail to root it out, however, you'll find 5 the next day, 50 after that. And then, my brothers and sisters, your lawn is totally, completely, and profligately covered with dandelions. By then you see them for the weeds they really are, but by then it's gasp too late. I can be a good sport about adverbs though. Yes, I can, with one exception, dialogue attribution. I insist that you use the adverb in dialogue attribution only in the rarest and most special of occasions, and not even then if you can avoid it. Just to make sure we all know what we're talking about, examine these 3 sentences. Put it down, she shouted. Give it back, he pleaded, it's mine. Don't be such a fool, Jekyll, Utterson said. In these sentences, shouted, pleaded, and said are verbs of dialogue attribution. Now look at these dubious revisions. Put it down, she shouted menacingly. Give it back, he pleaded abjectly, it's mine. Don't be such a fool, Jekyll, Utterson said contemptuously. The 3 latter sentences are all weaker than the 3 former ones, and most readers will see why immediately. Don't be such a fool, Jekyll, Utterson said contemptuously, is the best of the lot. It is only a cliche, while the other 2 are actively ludicrous. Such dialogue attributions are sometimes known as Swifties after Tom Swift, the brave inventor/hero in a series of boys' adventure novels written by Victor Appleton II. Appleton was fond of such sentences as, do your worst, Tom cried bravely, and my father helped with the equations, Tom said modestly. When I was a teenager, there was a party game based on one's ability to create witty or half-witty Swifties. You got a nice butt, lady, he said cheekily, is one I remember. Wink, wink. Another is, I'm the plumber, he said, with a flush. In this case, the modifier is an adverbial phrase. When debating whether or not to make some pernicious dandelion of an adverb part of your dialogue attribution, I suggest you ask yourself if you really want to write the sort of prose that might wind up in a party game. Some writers try to evade the no adverb rule by shooting the attribution full of steroids. The result is familiar to any reader of pulp fiction or paperback originals. Put down the gun, Utterson, Jekyll grated. Never stop kissing me, Shayna gasped. You damn tease, Bill jerked out. Don't do these things, please, oh please. The best form of dialogue attribution is said, as in he said, she said, Bill said, Monica said. If you want to see this put stringently into practice, I urge you to read or reread a novel by Larry McMurtry, The Shane of Dialogue Attribution. That looks damn snide on the page, but I'm speaking with complete sincerity. McMurtry has allowed few adverbial dandelions to grow on his lawn. He believes in he said, she said, even in moments of emotional crisis. And in Larry McMurtry novels, there are a lot of those. Go and do thou likewise. Is this a case of do as I say, not as I do? The reader has a perfect right to ask the question, and I have a duty to provide an honest answer. Yes, it is. You need only to look back through some of my own fiction to know that I'm just another ordinary sinner. I've been pretty good about avoiding the passive tense, but I've spilled out my share of adverbs in my time, including some, it shames me to say, in dialogue attribution. I've never fallen so low as he grated or Bill jerked out, though. When I do it, it's usually for the same reason any writer does it, because I'm afraid the reader won't understand me if I don't. I'm convinced that fear is at the root of most bad writing. If one is writing for one's own pleasure, then that fear may be mild. Timidity is the word I've used here. If, however, one's working under deadline, a school paper, a newspaper article, the SAT writing sample, that fear may be intense. Dumbo got airborne with the help of a magic feather. You may feel the urge to grasp a passive verb or one of those nasty adverbs for the same reason. Just remember before you do that, Dumbo didn't need the feather. The magic was in him. You probably do know what you're talking about and can safely energize your prose with active verbs. And you probably have told your story well enough to believe that when you use he said, the reader will know how he said it, fast or slowly, happily or sadly. Your man may be floundering in a swamp, and by all means, throw him a rope if he is, but there's no need to knock him unconscious with 90 feet of steel cable. Good writing is often about letting go of fear and affectation. Affectation itself, beginning with the need to define some sorts of writing as good and other sorts of bad, is fearful behavior. Good writing is also about making good choices when it comes to picking the tools you plan to work with. No writer is entirely without sin in these matters. Although William Strunk got E.B. White in his clutches when White was but a naive undergraduate at Cornell, and although White both understood and shared Strunk's prejudice against loose writing and the loose thinking which prompts it, he admits, I suppose I have written the fact that 1,000 times in the heat of composition, revised it out maybe 500 times in the cool aftermath. To be batting only 500 this late in the season, to fail half the time, to connect with this fat pitch saddens me. Yet E.B. White went on to write for a good many years following his initial revisions of Strunk's Little Book in 1957. I will go on writing in spite of such stupid lapses as "you can't be serious," Bill said unbelievingly. I expect you to do the same thing. There is a core simplicity to the English language and its American variant, but it's a slippery core. All I ask is that you do as well as you can, and remember that while to write adverbs is human, to write he said or she said is divine. Pause for water. Home stretch now. Lift out the top layer of your toolbox, your vocabulary and all the grammar stuff. On the layer beneath go those elements of style upon which I've already touched. Strunk and White offer the best tools and the best rules you could hope for, describing them simply and clearly. They're offered with a refreshing strictness, beginning with the rule on how to form possessives. You always add apostrophe S, even when the word you're modifying ends in S. Always write Thomas's bike and never Thomas apostrophe bike. And ending with ideas about where it's best to place the most important parts of a sentence. They say at the end, and everyone's entitled to his or her opinion, but I don't believe "with a hammer he killed Frank" will ever replace "he killed Frank with a hammer." Before leaving the basic elements of form and style, we ought to think for a moment about the paragraph, the form of organization which comes after the sentence. To that end, grab a novel, preferably when you haven't read yet, down from your shelf. The stuff I'm telling you applies to most prose, but since I'm a fiction writer, it's fiction I usually think about when I think about writing. Open the book in the middle and look at any 2 pages. Observe the pattern, the lines of type, the margins, and most particularly the blocks of white space where the paragraphs begin or leave off. You can tell without even reading if the book you've chosen is apt to be easy or hard, right? Easy books contain lots of short paragraphs, including dialogue paragraphs, which may be only a word or 2 long, and lots of white space. There's airy as Dairy Queen ice cream cones. Hard books, ones full of ideas, narration, or description, have a stouter look, a packed look. Paragraphs are almost as important for how they look as for what they say. They're maps of intent. In expository prose, paragraphs can and should be neat and utilitarian. The ideal expository graph contains a topic sentence followed by others, which explain or amplify the first. Here are 2 paragraphs from the ever-popular informal essay, which illustrate this simple but powerful form of writing. I'm not going to read it because we're getting a little bit crunched for time. Informal essays are, by and large, silly and insubstantial things. Unless you get a job as a columnist at your local newspaper, writing such fluffery is a skill you'll never use in the actual mall and filling station world. Teachers assign them when they can't think of any other way to waste your time. The most notorious subject, of course, is how I spent my summer vacation. I taught writing for a year at the University of Maine in Orono and had one class loaded with athletes and cheerleaders. They liked informal essays, greeting them like the old high school friends they were. I spent one whole semester fighting the urge to ask them to write 2 pages of well-turned prose on the subject of "if Jesus were my roommate." What held me back was the sure and terrible knowledge that most of them would take to the task with enthusiasm. Some might actually weep while in the throes of composition. Even in the informal essay, however, it's possible to see how strong the basic paragraph form can be. Topic sentence followed by support and description insists that the writer organize his or her thoughts, and it also provides a good insurance against wandering away from the topic. Wandering isn't a big deal in an informal essay. It's practically de rigueur, as a matter of fact, but it's a very bad habit to get into when working on more serious subjects in a more formal manner. Writing is refined thinking. If your master's thesis is no more organized than a high school essay titled "Why Shania Twain Turns Me On," you're in big trouble. In fiction, the paragraph is less structured. It's the beat instead of the actual melody. The more fiction you read and write, the more you'll find your paragraphs forming on their own, and that's what you want. When composing, it's best not to think too much about where the paragraphs begin and end. The trick is to let nature take its course. If you don't like it later on, fix it then. That's what rewrite is all about. It says check out the following. I don't want to. It says we could have a writing class just on this. It's got a lot of, let's see, if we did a class on this, it would encompass dialogue attribution, phonetically rendered language, the use of the comma, the decision not to use the apostrophe where the speaker is dropped a G, and all that stuff is just from the top level of his toolbox. Let's stick with the paragraphs though. Notice how easily they flow, with the turns and rhythms of the story dictating where each one begins and ends. The opening graph is of the classic type, beginning with a topic sentence that's supported by the sentences which follow. Others, however, exist solely to differentiate between Dale's dialogue and Big Tony's. The most interesting paragraph is the fifth one. Big Tony sat down, lit a cigarette, ran a hand through his hair. It's only a single sentence long, and expository paragraphs almost never consist of a single sentence. It's not even a very good sentence, technically speaking. To make it perfect in the Warner sense, there should be a conjunction. And also, what exactly is the purpose of this paragraph? First, the sentence may be flawed in a technical sense, but it's a good one in terms of the entire passage. Its brevity and telegraphic style vary the pace and keep the writing fresh. Suspense novelist Jonathan Kellerman uses this technique very carefully. We're not going to do that. It's possible to overuse the well-turned fragment, but frags can also work beautifully to streamline narration, create clear images, and create tension, as well as to vary the prose line. A series of grammatically proper sentences that can stiffen that line, make it less pliable. Purists hate to hear that and will deny it to their dying breath, but it's true. Language does not always have to wear a tie and lace up shoes. The object of fiction isn't grammatical correctness, but to make the reader welcome and then tell a story. Writing is seduction. Good talk is part of seduction. If not so, why do so many couples who start the evening at dinner wind up in bed? I'm trying to just get to the end here because we're not going to have much time left. I'm going to forget about Big Tony here. Wait a minute here. This is what I want to see. I would argue that the paragraph, not the sentence, is the basic unit of writing, the place where coherence begins and words stand a chance of becoming more than mere words. If the moment of quickening is to come, it comes at the level of the paragraph. It's a marvelous and flexible instrument that can be a single word long or run on for pages. And it talks about a novel where one paragraph is 16 pages long. That's insane. You must learn to use it well if you write well. What this means is lots of practice. You have to learn the beat. Grab that book you were looking at off the shelf again, would you? The weight of it in your hands tells you other stuff that you can take in without reading a single word. The book's length, naturally, but more. The commitment the writer shouldered in order to create the work, the commitment constant reader must make to digest it. Not that length and weight alone indicate excellence. Many epic tales are pretty much epic crap. Just ask my critics who will moan about entire Canadian forests massacred in order to print my drivel. Conversely, short doesn't always mean sweet. In some cases, short means far too sweet. But there is that matter of commitment, whether a book is good or bad, a failure or a success. Words have weight. Ask anyone who works in the shipping department of a book company warehouse or in the storage room of a large bookstore. Words create sentences. Sentences create paragraphs. Sometimes paragraphs quicken and begin to breathe. Imagine, if you like, Frankenstein's monster on its slab. Here comes lightning, not from the sky, but from a humble paragraph of English words. Maybe it's the first really good paragraph you ever wrote, something so fragile and yet full of possibility that you were frightened. You feel as Victor Frankenstein must have when the dead conglomeration of sewn together spare parts suddenly opened its watery yellow eyes. Oh my God, it's breathing, you realize. Maybe it's even thinking. What in hell's name do I do next? You go on to the third level, of course, and begin to write real fiction. Why shouldn't you? Carpenter, why should you fear? Carpenters don't build monsters after all. They build houses, stores, and banks. They build some of wood, a plank at a time, and some of brick, a brick at a time. You will build a paragraph at a time, constructing these of your vocabulary and your knowledge of grammar and basic style. As long as you stay level on the level and shave even every door, you can build whatever you like, whole mansions if you have the energy. Is there any rationale for building entire mansions of words? I think there is, and that the readers of Gone with the Wind and Bleak House understand it. Sometimes even a monster is no monster. Sometimes it's beautiful, and we fall in love with all that story, more than any film or TV program could ever hope to provide. Even after 1,000 pages, we don't want to leave the world the writers made for us or the make-believe people who live there. You wouldn't leave after 2,000 pages if there were 2,000. The Rings trilogy of J.R.R. Tolkien is a perfect example of this. 1,000 pages of Hobbits hasn't been enough for 3 generations of post-World War II fantasy fans. Even when you add in that clumsy galumphing dirigible of an epilogue, the Silmarillion, it hasn't been enough. Hence, the Questing Rabbits of Watership Down and half a hundred others. The writers of these books are creating the hobbits they still love and pine for. They're trying to bring Frodo and Sam back from the Grey Havens because Tolkien is no longer around to do it for them. At its most basic, we are only discussing a learned skill, but do we not agree that sometimes the most basic skills can create things far beyond our expectations? We are talking about tools and carpentry, about words and style, but as we move along, you do well to remember that we are also talking about magic. And what perfect time to end it, because it is 2:08 and the bell is going to ring in less than a minute. So that's kind of remarkable that we actually ended that. And we can talk about it a little bit tomorrow before you guys do your discussion posts, but I'm glad that we got through it together anyway. Okay, so that's it. I will see y'all tomorrow to do the discussion post.
Ciao.